Good day, everyone. My name is Alan Smason. I'm the president of the American Jewish Press Association, and I want to thank you for joining us today. We have a very important discussion, one of our continuing webinars for the American Jewish Press Association. And we'd like to welcome our guests who are here today to discuss essentially the anniversary of a very ignoble series of events, the Babyn Yar tragedy during World War II. Our guests today include the very noted Natan Sharansky, as well as Dr. Robert Citino. And if I may take just a moment, I'd like to introduce them. For those of you who do not know, Natan Sharansky is the chairman of the board of the supervisory board of the Babyn Yar Holocaust Memorial Center. The Memorial Center brings together a museum, a research institute, a library, an archive, and an online platform to educate people around the world on the tragedy that took place between 1941 and 1943 in Kiev, Ukraine, when the Nazis shot between 70,000 and 100,000 people at Babyn Yar, including almost the entire Jewish population of Kiev. Mr. Sharansky was a political prisoner of the Soviet Union from 1977 to 1986. He served in 4 successive Israeli governments as minister and vice prime minister from 1996 to 2006, and he was the head of the Jewish Agency from 2009 to 2018. He is a formidable human rights activist and was a leader in the struggle for the rights of Soviet Jews to immigrate to Israel. He is the recipient of the highest Israeli award, the Israel Prize, and is the recipient of the Congressional Medal of Honor and the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and is the only living non-American citizen who is the recipient of these 2 highest American awards, the others being Mother Teresa, Nelson Mandela, and Pope John Paul II. That's rarefied company you are in, Natan. Welcome today to our discussion. Also on the panel is Dr. Robert Citino, the Samuel Zemurray Stone Senior Historian and the Executive Director for the Study of War and Democracy at the National World War II Museum here in New Orleans. Robert Citino is the Executive Director of the Institute for the Study of War and Democracy. He is an award-winning military historian and scholar who's published 10 books. These include The Wehrmacht Retreats, Fighting a Lost War, 1943, Death of the Wehrmacht, the German campaigns of 1942 and 1943, and The German Way of War, from the 30 Years' Wars to the Third Reich, and numerous articles covering World War II and 20th century military history. He speaks widely and contributes very much to the general readership in magazines about World War II. Dr. Citino also enjoys close ties with the U.S. military establishment. He's taught 1 year at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point and 2 years at the U.S. Army War College. Again, both eminent people to be with us on this discussion today. Dr. Citino, thank you for coming as well.
It's an honor to be here, Alan, and an honor to be in the same, even virtual room with Mr. Sharansky.
Well, we're all happy to have him. And again, we're going to get to him. But I think for historical purposes, for those of us who may not be as informed as you, if you could please fill us in about what Babyn Yar was all about. And of course, I know that I first came into contact with the whole concept of what happened there because of my association with classical music, and that Shostakovich had written one of his symphonies titled Babyn Yar. And that was when I first came into contact with it, and then did a little bit of research. I'm sure you have much more to acquaint us with in terms of what actually occurred in history. And as a historian, I'd appreciate if you could just sort of set the table for us and let us find out a little bit more about it.
Thank you, Alan, and thanks to everyone for being here. As I already said to the group before we all convened, I long for the days when we can do these in person, when we can mix great content and discussion of history with actual human fellowship. And I hope those days are coming back soon. As Alan said, let me just set the table a bit for a deeper discussion about memory by saying something about the historical facts of the matter, exactly what happened at Babyn Yar. 80 years ago, in the fall of 1941, the German Wehrmacht was driving deep into the Soviet Union. This is part of Operation Barbarossa, the great invasion of the summer of 1941. The Germans had already won some of the most signal battlefield victories of all time at Bialystok, at Minsk, and especially at Kiev. In that last battle, German forces had sealed off gigantic encirclement surrounding and destroying nearly 4 Soviet armies, taking some 700,000 prisoners. The numbers are mind-boggling. Soviet forces were still holding strong on the main road, if you will, to Moscow, but much of Ukraine was now in German hands. Besides that, winning victories on the battlefield, the Germans were also doing something else inside the Soviet Union since they had crossed the border in June. They had been killing civilians en masse, largely by shooting them. Maximum terror against the civilian population was the order of the day in German military operations. Now, a couple of points there. Even before the campaign began, Hitler and his high command were issuing patently illegal orders to the troops. The war against the USSR, Hitler had said back in March of 1941, cannot be conducted in a knightly fashion, in a chivalrous fashion. It was a war of ideology, a war of racial difference. Communist Party officials had to be liquidated, he said, without mercy. On the eve of the campaign, the army issued a so-called commissar order permitting German soldiers to shoot any Communist Party officials who fell into their hands, or frankly, anyone who fell into their hands without fear of any sorts of legal reprisals. Hitler spoke of the originators of barbaric Asiatic methods of warfare, the political commissars. When captured in battle or offering resistance, they were to be shot on principle. That is, without even thinking a second thought. Now, Hitler was a brute by nature. I'm sure I don't have to tell you that. And the fact that he would condone murder is hardly surprising. But we must also take into account his particular ideological obsessions. He's an anti-communist to the core, of course. He would have said anti-Bolshevik. And he is as rabid an anti-Semite who ever walked the earth. He saw Barbarossa as much more than a standard military campaign with a winner and a loser and a peace treaty at the end. Instead, this would be a war of annihilation, destroying the USSR, along with the Bolshevik ideology that propped it up, as well as the millions of Jews living in the Soviet Union whom he viewed as the principal authors and supporters of communist ideology, both in the Soviet Union and elsewhere. So this was not merely a military clash. I would liken it to a crusade, in Hitler's mind at least, which is the mind here I think that matters, against his two fiercest enemies and obsessions, which he combined into a single concept that the phrase he used repeatedly, Jewish Bolshevism. Laura, I wonder if we can just have a first slide, please. I just have a brief series of slides, so I'm not going to, hopefully this won't be taking up too long. Here's so if you can turn that into a slideshow. There we go, thank you. So here's the theater of war for Operation Barbarossa. The Germans had already overrun Poland in 1939. There was a great campaign off map in the West in 1940, a surprisingly easy victory. And then an invasion of the Soviet Union proper in June of 1941, Operation Barbarossa. And so all the arrows, if you will, all the arrows are heading east. The Soviet armies are being destroyed at the border or driven back towards Moscow. Next slide, please, Laura. And while that very dramatic development is ongoing, here are just sort of a brief list of the massacre sites where we now know, physical evidence exists to prove that German troops, both army and more politicized troops of the SS, will have something to say about that. We're rounding up either Soviet officials or Jews and murdering them. And so that is what's happening. It's two wars. There's a war against the Soviet Union, which I think we can put into a standard category of state-on-state violence. And then there's the war against the Jews, as Lucy Davidovich, long ago, an American scholar, wrote a book on this topic. It was quite eye-opening for Americans at the time, at least, called The War on the Jews. And these two wars are happening simultaneously. And so, even in the earliest stages of the campaign, the Wehrmacht was accompanied by so-called SS Einsatzgruppen, action teams is a translation. I use death squads, and I think it's more accurate as to what we're talking about, who moved into occupied regions just behind the frontline troops, often just behind them, rounding up and shooting Soviet officials and military commissars, but especially targeting Jews. Now, one of the most infamous of these massacres took place in Ukraine, just outside the capital city, Kiev. Before the war, about 160,000 Jews lived in Kiev. That was roughly a fifth of the city's population, which is a little bit under 1 million, maybe 850,000. Most of that population, most of that 160,000 had already fled, 100,000 or so, ahead of the approaching Germans, or they were young men who'd been drafted into the Soviet army. By the time the Germans took Kiev towards the middle of September 1941, there were only about 60,000 Jews remaining in the city. And given the demographics that I just outlined, largely women, children, the elderly, the sick, those who could not flee from the German approach. Now, to the matter at hand, I guess we would say. During their catastrophic retreat from Kiev, and it was helter-skelter, the Soviet army had sown mines and other explosive devices all over the city. Now, early on in the German occupation, 2 major explosions rocked the center of Kiev, killing a large number of German soldiers, officers, occupation officials who even then were already moving into the city. German officials used these blasts as the pretext for an action against the remaining Jewish population of the city. On September 29th and 30th, next slide, please, Laura. The Germans rounded up the Jews of Kiev, took them to Babyn ravine, which at least at the time was just outside of the city of Kiev, and shot over 33,000 people in a 2-day period. The lead perpetrators here were the men of Sonderkommando 4A, a special detachment, we would call it, from Einsatzgruppe C. The Soviet front was divided into 4 sectors, and each sector got a battalion or so of these Einsatzgruppen, these murderers who would comb the district for Jews and shoot them usually somewhere outside of town. So Babyn Yar in that sense is quite typical. These men were under the command of SS Standartenführer, Paul Blobel. We can see him next, and that was, I think, the last of my slides. That would be equivalent to a U.S. Army colonel. This, of course, is not Blobel in full SS regalia, black and tall, shiny boots and strutting around with a whip, as he tended to do. This is Blobel after the war, identified as a perpetrator and on trial. He would be tried and convicted at Nuremberg and hanged in June of 1951, just about 10 years after the crime he committed. Now, 3 things. I'll just make 3 brief comments and then turn things over to Natan, which I'm sure we're all waiting for. The first point I'd like to make, at Babyn Yar as elsewhere, the mass shooting of Jews was often hidden under the pretext of rear area security or anti-partisan warfare. Although I hope I've made it plain that what we're talking about here and elsewhere in those massacre sites is cold-blooded murder of men, women, and children. While Babyn Yar might have been the largest single action, it was just one of many. But by the end of 1941, so about 6 months into the campaign, German Einsatzgruppen had probably shot over 1 million people. It's a mind-boggling then and mind-boggling to study today. Second point. Babyn Yar forces us, I think, to reevaluate the history of the German army in World War II, and it's where I've spent most of my academic career, writing books on the German army, not just in World War II, but its development from Prussia and even in earlier times. But I think this forces us to a bit of reevaluation. Despite the post-war claims of German army officers who blamed all the murders on Nazi officials and the SS, or Hitler made us do it, the Wehrmacht itself, the German armed forces, were complicit in all these crimes. Mass murder on this scale requires logistics. It requires weapons, ammunition, trains, trucks, communications, perimeter security, and much more. And all these things were provided to the death squads by the German army itself. So there can be no talk of an evil SS and a German army that had clean hands and fought a clean struggle. And finally, my third and last point. What happened at Babyn Yar also forces us to reevaluate the nature of the Holocaust itself, or at least the view that was so common for decades after 1945. It was often portrayed as an industrialized process carried out in a business-like fashion at these gigantic camps, death camps like Sobibor, Treblinka, and of course, especially Auschwitz. Auschwitz has come to become an icon, a sort of symbol of this entire development. But the Holocaust was much more varied than a sort of industrialized process, a factory of production. In its earliest incarnation, at places like Babyn Yar, it was a parade of mass shootings, open-air massacres, and hastily dug graves. Scholars today refer to the Holocaust by bullets. if we still adhere to the 6 million number, and it can, you can shave it, make it smaller, or see that it was a little bigger, but 6 million is the figure. If we still adhere to the 6 million figure, at least 1 million of that, and maybe 1.5 million of that did not happen in places like Auschwitz. It happened at places like Babyn Yar, and that's all the more reason to remember the grisly events of September 1941. Thank you.
Natan, you've had your own history to speak of, and I know that we'll talk about Babyn Yar, but I know that we would be remiss if we didn't more or less delve into some of your past and how you have come to be involved with Babyn Yar as the chairman of the board there.
Thank you, Alan, and thank you, Professor, for your very impressive, interesting, if it can be called interesting, of course, a review of the events. So Babyn Yar is by far the biggest mass grave of Holocaust. And as a result, it is the symbol of the Holocaust by bullets. The symbol of that Holocaust when 1.5 million Jews of Ukraine and some other East European countries were killed even before Auschwitz existed. And killed exactly in the way as it was discussed. Babyn Yar became the symbol of this killing when 34,000 people got taken out of the city. Today it is in the city, then taken by very small groups to the edge of the yard. It's Raven, then forced to strip. There's so much energy was forced that to humiliate each and every of them, to take off their clothes and then to kill person. And then one layer of people, and then the second layer of people, 7 layers of people killed, and that was an awful picture. But Babyn Yar at the same time is the symbol of the efforts of Soviet communist Bolshevik regime to erase the memory about Holocaust, about Babyn Yar. First of all, physically, they tried first in 1952, they tried to turn it into the big place for the waste waters from all the factories around. And then the nature raised against it. As a result of putting so much waste water in one place, which there was a flood at some moment, and Podolia, the area which was down, 1,500 people were killed by this water flood. And then it was we turned into the biggest stadium, sports complex, and then biggest park. And so, but in addition to the physical destroying Babyn Yar, Soviet Union, beginning from approximately 1947, 1948, started the policy of erasing all the memory about these events in the books of history. And I'm born in 1948. I grew in Ukraine among the killing fields of Holocaust, only a few miles from my home in the city of Donetsk in Ukraine. Then it was called Stalino. Only a few miles from my home is the second biggest grave after Babyn Yar. 75,000 people were thrown into the tunnel of the mine, into the mine, into the pit of the mine. 75,000 people. And I grow knowing nothing about it. We know nothing about Holocaust. And we are playing games about the Second World War, and we are so proud with the medals which our fathers brought from the war. And we know nothing about the fact that 1.5 million Jews were just a few years ago killed in Ukraine. And then the word Babyn Yar was like underground word. And I remember that moment of excitement. I was 13 years old. My father is reading to me the poem of Evtushenko, Babyn Yar, published in Soviet newspaper. And he's with trembling hands and trembling voice, he says, now we can talk about it. But he was wrong. Next day, it was prohibited and the poet was attacked, forced to change the words. And then Shostakovich wrote a symphony, Babyn Yar. And again, It was played only once in Moscow Shostakovich. It was by far the biggest name of the composer in the Soviet Union, and it was prohibited almost immediately. So, and the question is why? And the only answer, every historian can say, the only answer is anti-Semitism. At some moment, Stalin, who went after many different social groups and national groups and religious groups, decided after the Second World War that is a good time to go after the Jews, and Jewish institutions were closed, and Jewish poets were arrested, tortured, and killed, and a plot against Jewish doctors who are trying to poison Soviet leaders was prepared, and then Stalin died. And he died, and probably it saved many Jewish lives. By the way, the trial was planned for the Pesach, and he died on Purim, what means like 1 month before. And probably saved a lot of lives. But the policy of discrimination of Jews and also destroying the memory of the Holocaust continued for many years. So here is the challenge. And our challenge is no more, no less, to turn this symbol of the attempts to erase the memory about Holocaust into the place where there will be the biggest center for studying Holocaust by bullets, museum, and scientific and research center.
And again, unlike Auschwitz, which is still standing, Babyn Yar is for the most part hidden, correct?
Babyn Yar, until recently, it is a huge park. There is no raven. It is a huge park where people are walking with their dogs in the morning, and there is still a stadium, and there are houses around it. And Ukraine became independent, the Soviet Union disappeared. I have to say, Ukraine government immediately said that they want to recognize the history. And so there was put some very modest memorial about it. But all the efforts to do something bigger, they failed, or because of bureaucracy, or because of different types of corruption. The governments changed. And that is why when a few years ago, 5 years ago, mayor of the city came to me with some big donors, some of them are from Russia, from Ukraine, but all of them have a lot of families killed there. And he said that now we are going to do something very serious if we'll be ready to, and we will need a lot of international support. And in fact, what they really meant is we'll have a lot of political problems. And will you agree to lead this, the international board? I immediately agreed. I decided that is the moment to for changing for making the real history of the Holocaust by bullets known. And I have to say that now it is very slow, it's a very difficult process, because all this area was changed, and there are the offices and the institutions which are not going to disappear by themselves, and you have to get permission for every square meter there. But it goes, and I think in 5 years from now, we really will have the biggest and the unique Holocaust memorial about Holocaust by bullets in the place of the biggest massive grave of Holocaust.
In many ways, Natan, you are the only person to lead this campaign because of the fact that you were there in a sense, but unknowing about what the history was, and just finding out about it bit by bit, and that perhaps now you'll be able to inform the rest of the world through the research of others that will be there as to what actually happened. Robert, I'd like to ask you to come in. How is it that we have knowledge of the events at Babyn Yar? Who was responsible for not only taking the criminals to task in terms of the trials, but how did we find out about it?
So it's in the midst of wartime, it's always very difficult to sort out allegations of massacre. Because all sides are accusing each other of all sorts of nefarious things. There was a murder of 5,000 Polish officers in the midst of the war at a place called Katyn. And the Soviets said, the Germans did it. And most Westerners were willing to believe that. The Germans were awful. They were murdering people left and right. But Of course, we know as more and more facts came out, it was quite obvious that these Polish officers had been shot by Soviet officials, by the NKVD, the sort of flip side of the German SS. So, you know, when we're mentioning, at least I was discussing the first massacre at Babyn Yar, which is late September. There were others until you can say that the entire Polish population entire Jewish population of Kiev was killed by the Germans. They're repeated massacres. Any criminal will tell you that killing someone is fairly simple. Disposing of the body is very, very difficult. And it's how 90% of murderers are caught. Well, multiply that problem by 60,000. And so, you know, the Germans were heading east and they were in control of Ukraine, but at some point the worm turned, if you will, around late 1942 at a place called Stalingrad. And the Soviets now were the ones encircling and destroying German armies and moving to the west. And so the Germans are now retreating. They're desperate attempts to hide what they had done, often carried out by the SS or some local auxiliaries. One of the difficult problems, and I know Natan will understand what I'm talking about here, so, you know, there was local participation in the massacres of the Jews as well by your non-Jewish neighbors were giving you, we're turning you into the Nazis or telling the Nazis where to find you or whatever it might be. So they're local, but the work of the Germans and also local auxiliaries, desperate attempts to cover this up. But Alan, I have to tell you, there is no way short of, I don't know, you need a nuclear explosion to hide the remnants of 60,000 people. And so, you know, very early on in the war, there was talk of war crimes trials at the end. War is a crime, I believe, and criminal things happen on all sides. I think any child killed during a war is a crime by some good standards. But what you have here is crimes that had just gone beyond the pale that normally accompany military events. I'm speaking largely here of the Germans. And so the Allies decided at the Tehran conference, late 1943, that once this war was over, there were going to be war crimes trials. And already dossiers were being compiled. There's one other, so that's why you had that picture of Paul Blobel at Nuremberg being tried. But there's one more curious fact to add to this mix. And anyone who studied the Holocaust probably knows what it is. It's the Germans, the Nazi state, were obsessive record keepers. They kept records of every single thing they had done, which makes it unusual in a case of murder. Normally, you try to cover your tracks. You try to destroy any documentation. You try to sort of wipe the slate clean and pretend it didn't happen. But you know, these things they're photographed. There's photographic evidence of the massacre at Babyn Yar, sometimes taken by official SS photographers, other times by individual perpetrators or bystanders themselves, just getting a record of it. By the way, that starts very early on in World War II. The German invasion of Poland was accompanied by repeated massacres as well. Photographic evidence of it. There's a picture of Leni Riefenstahl, the great Nazi filmmaker who made Triumph of the Will. She was in Poland to film some of that campaign, and she was present at a civilian massacre. Someone has a picture of her. She's broken down in tears, and she can't believe what she's seeing. At least there was some human being underneath the Nazi propagandist, I'm happy to say. But the reason we know about it is largely because of the meticulous records the Germans kept, including visual ones.
Natan, if I could ask you, perhaps in your memory, having grown up under an authoritarian state and having to deal with a very repressive series of regimes and actions set against you, how is it that you came to know about the Babyn Yar massacres, as it were, and what you call, I think rather appropriately, a Holocaust by bullets?
Well, first of all, you have to understand, the Soviet Union, immediately when they were coming back during the war in 1943, they came to Kiev and then to the other places. They invited all the world, they invited American journalists to see these awful massacres. They organized some open trial against those whom at that moment they caught. And somehow, in the end of the war, it's abruptly changed. Stalin gave the order, the book which was prepared by Ehrenburg and some other Jews, was a black book describing exactly what was done by Hitler, by Nazis from place to place, was prohibited to publish. And from the end of 44, from 45, it disappears. So when I grew as a loyal Soviet citizen, I could know nothing. We were excited when Yevtushenko wrote something, but it was prohibited, so it was all rumors. When I became activist of human rights movement and the Jewish Soviet Jewry movement, one of my first the detentions was when I was on my way to Babyn Yar on the 29th of September. I and the other activists were simply arrested. But what we started doing, we started publishing the things which were in samizdat, in the underground. We started distributing it among the people. We got the information which could be brought by American tourists, which they brought to Soviet Union, information which was published about it. And so we knew that something awful happened. We didn't have access to the, of course, to the Soviet archives. It's true that German archives, the fact that we know exactly the figure, how many Jews were killed in those 2 days, 33,459 Jews, it's because of German archives. So we could get them almost through underground. And then, and finally, when the Soviet Union fell apart, there was limited but access to the Soviet archives. And what we are doing now, we are opening like Kiev archives of the registration of the citizens, and you find out that even today you can get a lot of new information. Only the last year we found about 1,000 new names of people who were killed in Babyn Yar, and it's simply from comparing archives which are in Kiev and archives which are in some other places. So it's difficult to work after after 80 years. On the 80th anniversary of Babyn Yar, Berlin Symphonic Orchestra came to Babyn Yar and was playing the poem of the Symphony of Shostakovich and singing the poem of Yevtushenko. Symbolical, it's a very powerful act, but it's very sad that only today we are getting all this information, comparing different archives about what and with whom it happened and who are the perpetrators. We just published the list of 159 German soldiers who were involved in physical killing these people. And we are going to publish, of course, the names of those who were collaborating. And and of course, there is a long list of the noble people who were trying to save Jews, 2,600 Ukrainian families all over Ukraine tried to save the Jews, risking their own lives, and the names of the victims, of course. So it's very important to know the truth, to know how it happened, and to learn from it.
And
a few years ago now, a great book by American scholar Raoul Hilberg, grouped everyone into sort of three groups. You're a victim, a perpetrator, and a bystander. And it's curious to me to hear the language that Natan is using, because I still think that's the way we have to look at it. This could not have been done without perpetrators, of course. Crimes can be, but also could not have been done without bystanders of just people who knew what was happening and said, well, turned away and said, I don't want to get involved in that. I'll get in trouble, or whatever it might be.
I noticed that one of the things that Natan brought up, the Holocaust by bullets, some historians, and I don't know whether or not, Dr. Citino, you want to weigh in on this or not, state that Babyn Yar was perhaps the turning point, that the Germans, the Nazis, decided at that point that perhaps the cost of using bullets was uneconomical, and that they needed to come up with a more efficient manner of killing and disposing. Is that safe to say, or am I over?
No, I'll weigh in that briefly on that. Yeah, I think it is true. I think there was also this Nazi quest for standardization and for rationalization of this process, and right now it was happening very haphazardly. One Einsatz group, a commander might be really active and hard driving, and another might be lax, and another might be incompetent. If the entire process could be streamlined, then it could be centrally planned. There are tales, too many to simply disregard them, that the perpetrators themselves shooting people all day is extraordinarily psychologically devastating. You need more and more alcohol, which is essentially what the Einsatzgruppen were experiencing. And so that was not at all the view of how this process was supposed to take place that was held in Berlin by Hitler or Himmler. And Himmler himself viewed a mass shooting on one occasion and was supposedly sickened by what he had seen, quite rightly. And so I do think that, Babyn Yar and the events of the fall of 1941 said this entire process has to be brought sort of under control and put on a more rational basis. And so I think that is the transfer from the Babyn Yar Shoah to the Auschwitz Shoah. Yeah.
Natana, if you would, tell us how you became, if you will, I know you were very involved with the Israeli government after you had been in Israel and had emigrated from the Soviet Union. But I guess I have to find a way to, how did you make that connection to become now, after the chairman of the Jewish Agency for Israel, to head up this effort for the Babyn Yar Memorial?
First of all, as I mentioned before, I'm connected with this topic by my birthright, through all my childhood. And it was fighting against attempts to raise the memory of Jewish people was very important part of my activity in Soviet Union. But in the free world and in Israeli government, I was responsible, among other things, about fighting new anti-Semitism, fighting this global hatred towards Jews, but also towards Israel. And what I found that always it goes hand in hand, this all the new anti-Semitism goes hand in hand with the attempts to raise the memory about Holocaust, to deny Holocaust, to underplay the importance of Holocaust. It seems that those who are calling for the destruction of Israel, they don't want people to remember where it can bring us to. And so dealing with this topic of a historical memory of Jewish people on one hand, and the fight against anti-Semitism. So even when I retired from all my positions, to me, to become the chairman of the ISGAP, Institute Fighting with Global Anti-Semitism, and to become the chairman of the board. By the way, our board includes the former president of Poland and the former foreign minister of Germany and the American senators, many distinguished people. It is very important to protect it in all this project and all these political games. But it was very natural for me to connect fighting against all the new anti-Semitism and fighting for restoring the memory about Holocaust.
And Dr. Citino, at the National World War II Museum, do we have any permanent parts of your exhibit that deals with these massacres?
We are building our last permanent exhibit, which is the Liberation Pavilion. It's the end of the war, and it's how the Holocaust, we will be discussing how the Holocaust came to be known in the United States. So what was known and exactly how it came to be part of the American cultural heritage, for lack of a better term. So we'll be looking pretty deeply into the Holocaust by bullets, and of course into the sort of the transference from the Holocaust by bullets of transformation into the Holocaust by factory. We'll be looking at all those things. That new Liberation Pavilion should be open sometime about this time next year. I would say late fall of 2022. The building is coming out of the ground. We've been discussing all these things with experts in the field, participating in forums like this one, assembling our artifacts. So we're pretty excited about it. But these things do take time, and this one is going to take a bit of time to come out of the ground.
And of course, as we all know, between the COVID pandemic and shutdown of our society in many ways, things slowed down. This pavilion was supposed to be opened up by this time.
Exactly. I arrived at the museum in 2016, and I won't tell you how many times the schedule slipped a little bit, but of course the big slip was started in the spring of 2020 when we closed down. And the museum was not closed down that long, from April, so I can't remember the exact date, to Memorial Day. So it was a couple of months, but of course our visitorship, that takes a while to rebuild. tourism, of which we depend, to people to come to New Orleans to see the museum, that takes a while to rebuild. So there's that was the big slippage in schedule, but we're on track now, and I have a stack of work to do on this project that is next to this computer right now that I won't even share with everyone at the moment.
And Natan, you may be interested in learning why in the world would they put the National World War II Museum in New Orleans? And it all goes back to the efforts of Stephen Ambrose, the historian, and others, including, of course, I know there are a lot of other people who got involved in it, but he had interviewed, or at least had taken up the quote that was done by, I believe, General Dwight David Eisenhower, who of course became president, that the war was won essentially because of Andrew Higgins and the Higgins boats that allowed the Allied forces to land on the shores of Normandy and stage the beachhead at D-Day. And he said, without those boats and the mobilization efforts that were there by the Allies, that we would not have been able to win the war. Or at least he gave that as a major credit as to why the Allies won. So
if I may intervene just real briefly, that just one thing to add. So for those in the room who might not know what a Higgins boat is, Andrew Higgins was a shipbuilder in New Orleans, and he built this amphibious landing craft. So if you think of the opening scene of Saving Private Ryan, and the American Army is landing in Normandy, and the boat's kind of ungainly craft, and a ramp comes down, and the soldiers charge off the ramp. The Higgins boat, amphibious landing craft. Built in New Orleans, and President Eisenhower famously said they won the war for us. So that, at any rate, is the sort of long story of why the museum, National World War II Museum, is not in Washington, D.C., but is in New Orleans, Louisiana. And frankly, I'm quite thankful for that. I love living in New Orleans.
Natan, can you tell me a little bit about the physical aspects of the center? What's going to be actually happening there in terms of, I know there's going to be a research center and other aspects to it. Could you speak a little bit about what it's going to be like once it's open fully?
Well, I see here Ruslan, one of our leading professionals, can speak more about the specific plans. I can say, first of all, already now, there are some major projects which are already launched in spite of COVID and all this, which the aim of which this project is to turn this place, which is connected with the public park, with the stadium, with to remind people what happened here, and to create a very solemn and dramatic atmosphere of remembrance. And so there are some very important projects which are already launched, and just now is finished the huge project which presents the tragedy in figures, people through special optics can see exactly these pictures where and how it was implemented. It's awful, but it's very important to understand. In addition, there'll be a huge archive which now is built on the internet, but it will be an access for everybody. There will be history. The Special Museum of the History of Holocaust by Bullets in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine, in Belarus, in Russia, in Romania, and some other places. There will be history of the efforts to erase the memory by Soviet Union. It is very dramatic, tragic, and sometimes absolutely unbelievable history of the efforts which are done by the totalitarian regime to destroy Babyn Yar and its memory and the victims of these efforts, but maybe no less important how it will be done. It all will be done with the new technologies and the language which can encourage to involve young generation, young people through the tools by which they're talking to one another to make them involved into the history. If you want more details, I propose you to ask Ruslan, who is here, about it.
You are actually reading my own thoughts. I just chatted with Ruslan. Ruslan, if you'll unmute yourself and you're able to talk, why don't you tell us a little bit more about what Natan had started talking about in terms of what's going to be available at the center?
Well, basically, next year, any visitor would face the first part of the memorial open. There will be a first part of Holocaust Museum in Eastern Europe, which will be dedicated to the first and the biggest mass shooting, the 29th and 30th of September 1941. And also there is beautiful synagogue opened already as part of this memorial. The artistic installation by Marina Abramovich, the Crystal Wall of Crying, as well as a installation dedicated to victims of the tragedy, the mirror field, and all of this together represents the first part of the memorial that any visitor would see as they come to Babyn Yar. And this is no longer a park anymore. This is basically a memorial which dominates over the park. In the next coming years, we expect number of museums to be built, as Natan already said, and we must understand that this is a vast territory of 132 hectares. And it is very difficult to work with it. And what we expect to do next year is to build a very detailed master plan of the territory with all the museums and architects working to deliver the plans. And that means that we expect within the next 5 years, basically creating this memorial on the ground.
And again, I want to thank you. Can you give me a little bit of background about how you came to this project and sort of introduce yourself to everybody, since sort of you're put on the spot?
I'm with the project for 2 years now. I'm responsible for to oversee the academic research, international relations, and public affairs in Ukraine and abroad. And basically, my job is to connect different parts of the organization, including the artistic part of the organization with historical part. And I'm with the project after I've been advisor to Deputy Prime Minister of Ukraine for European integration. And I worked as advisor to Chief of Defense of Ukraine during first years of the war with Russia. Before that, I worked as corporate government affairs in craft foods for Eastern Europe and Central Asia. So
okay, Ruslan, thank you. Let me take from here to emphasize 3 important points which Ruslan, in fact, mentioned and represent. First of all, Ruslan is Ukrainian, young relatively, and it is very important that in this team, which is working on this, there are many, not only Jewish, but Ukrainian, Russian, European young people who are very enthusiastically working with the project. Second, as Ruslan mentioned, he came from the government. At this moment, we have very close cooperation with the president's office, with the president of Ukraine and president's office. It doesn't mean that we don't have political problems, because the third thing which Ruslan mentioned, the war between Russia and Ukraine. The war, in addition to usual bureaucratic problems and problems of that there are some people who, inside Ukraine who are afraid that maybe it is dangerous to permit us to give our interpretation of Ukrainian history. After all, it is Ukrainian history and not somebody else. In addition, we have a war with Russia and suspicions that maybe we will be representing somehow the interests or that Russia is interested to present Ukraine in the wrong way and so on. It becomes, there is a lot of political challenges which we have, and I have to say that our local team who's learned to work with the government and with the Jewish organizations and at the same time implement this project, it's quite a challenge.
Well, we're getting close to the end of this discussion, but I did want to mention that we do have time for 1 or 2 questions from our audience. And if anybody has a question, now would be the time to perhaps ask it. I've advised people to put it in the chat, but however, we would be happy if we go ahead and want to unmute if anybody has a question that they'd like to put to our esteemed guest, Natan Sharansky or Dr. Robert Citino, to advance them at this time. Somebody may have a question that will maybe edify more about what we've maybe started talking about today, and that is, of course, this Babyn Memorial Center that is being built, and to learn more perhaps about the tragedy of what we've, I don't want to say celebrated, but we memorialized, if you will, on its 80th anniversary just at the end of September. Again, my purpose of being here is to facilitate this webinar, and we certainly hope anybody has a question can advance it, because we only have a few minutes remaining.
I have a question. It's Marshall Weiss from Dayton, Ohio. Thank you all for being with us. Mr. Sharansky, will you, in your role, will you have any role as kind of acting as a buffer against the pressures from the Ukrainian or the Russian government when it comes to telling the story? Is that something that you will be involved with?
That's one of the most important functions of our board. Why do we need such a board of prominent politicians from Europe, from America, from Ukraine? Well, it's clear that we need very powerful philanthropists, and we do have philanthropists from Ukraine, from Moscow, and from the United States. But as to for political leaders who are representing a lot of sympathy to Jewish history and a lot of sympathy to Ukraine at the same time, they are important exactly for this. We have to, of course, there are accusations that we are trying to undermine the role of Ukrainian collaborators in order to have good relations with the Ukrainian government. At the same time, we are accused that we are deliberately distorting or making accusations against Ukrainian collaborators more serious than it wasn't really, because it is in the interest of Russia today to do it. So when you accuse from both sides and the opposite things, probably you're on the right place. And that's why it is very important that we stick to historical narrative, which is not developed by us, which is developed by the specialists. And as I said, we are publishing the names. The moment you start publishing the names, on one hand, there is suspicion, but on the other hand, you can do nothing against the facts. Instead of being involved in the question, this national organization or this national organization, was they really cooperating as a national organization with the Hitler, or there are only some people who are doing? Instead of this, you're simply putting facts and names and how it happened. So in order, nobody can argue against it. Otherwise, we immediately will be confused. There is attempts to make us confused between different debates about historical role of this or that organization, group, or the country. And look how bad it is when on the level of the governments, like in Poland or some other countries, the government decides what is the real history of Holocaust in their own country. So we don't want this situation. And I have to say, at this stage, in spite of the lot of political attacks, which we have, and we have to defend our project, we have to defend the historical truth. We really must have a very strong international board, and I'm glad that we have this international board, which is the best guarantee that this project will not be used in the interest of one or another political group.
I'll just say that the museum business nowadays is you're swimming in troubled waters. There are cultural currents flowing this way and that. Questions of design. Some people will want you to look conservative and traditional. Others will want a more contemporary and media-driven approach. Anybody in the museum business right now knows that that's a factor. So I wish you well, Natan, and Ruslan, I wish you well as well.
Thank you.
That seems like an appropriate spot to jump off. I guess I want to thank everybody for being here. First off, I want to thank Iris Schaefer for her efforts in getting Natan to our discussion today. I want to thank Dr. Robert Citino for being with us during a very busy week. Dr. Citino, the group that you have coming to deal with the World War II Museum, the conference that you have is probably the most important. It's what group again that you're dealing with for the?
Well, so we, in partnership with the Pritzker Military Library and Museum in Chicago, I was just talking to someone in this group in Chicago. We put on this international conference every year, invite 30 or 35 of the finest speakers, the freshest research, the most up-to-date publications. And we just throw them out there in front of the American public and see what happens. It's really an exciting time, but it's a very busy time as well. This is also the 80th anniversary of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, which is something that, of course, our museum deals with in great detail, and we're going to be talking about it a lot. Conference starts tomorrow.
And of course, as I said, this is your week. You're here today with us, and we do appreciate you taking time out. Because
thank you, Alan. You're more than welcome. I can't imagine where I would rather have been for the last hour. So thanks to everyone.
And Natana, again, my hat to you for all of the work that you've done, not only with this project, but everything you've endured, everything you've done for the Jewish people, everything you've done both as a Soviet and an Israeli citizen. And again, I can't wait to see you and shake your hand in public again. All right.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
And so on behalf of the American Jewish Press Association, thank you all. Marshall Weiss, our past president, thank you for asking the question that you had. And again, everybody who was here today, I hope that you will have a very happy Thanksgiving if you live here in the United States. And again, coming up soon, we hope that we will all get to meet in public if you aren't able to go out in public that much because of the pandemic we've endured these past 19 months, but hopefully things are getting better. And I hope to see some of you in Israel soon. For that, I will say thank you all for joining us today. And on behalf of the American Jewish Press Association, have a very nice day.
Thank you.